Before America became a nation of cities and highways, it was a land of silence, mystery, and danger. There were no maps, no guides, only brave souls who dared to walk into the unknown. Among them stood one man, Jim Bridger. He was not born into fame or wealth. He did not wear a soldier's uniform or hold a hero's medal. He was just a boy, poor, alone, and restless, who would one day help shape the destiny of a nation. This is his story, the true story of the man who mapped the Wild West. Jim Bridger was born on March 17, 1804, in a small town called Richmond, Virginia. He came into a world that was young and wild, a country still trying to find its place. His parents, James Bridger and Chloe Bridger, were simple working people. They dreamed of a better life, like many families of that time. When Jim was still a child, his family packed up everything they owned and traveled west to Missouri. Back then, Missouri was not a peaceful place. It was the very edge of civilization, where the forests met the unknown frontier. There were no real towns, only scattered cabins, muddy roads, and endless land. But for young Jim, that land was magic. He would sit by the river, watching the sun melt into the horizon, and wonder what lay beyond it. No one could have guessed that one day, that same boy would explore those lands and become one of the most famous mountain men in history. When Jim was 13 years old, tragedy came without warning. His mother died first. Not long after, his father followed, just like that. Jim was alone. No brothers, no sisters, no one to guide him. Most boys would have broken down, but not Jim. He didn't cry for long. He simply got up, packed what little he had, and found work. He became an apprentice to a blacksmith, heating metal, hammering horseshoes, fixing tools. Day after day, he worked in the smoke and fire. But at night, he would look out at the stars and think, there must be more than this. Somewhere out there, something is waiting for me. That thought became his only friend. By the time Jim turned 17, he was tall, strong, and quiet. He had the sharp eyes of a hunter and the steady hands of a craftsman. But most of all, he had a restless heart. In 1822, a famous frontiersman named General William Ashley put up a notice in St. Louis. It called for 100 enterprising young men to join an expedition up the Missouri River to trap beavers and trade. First, Jim saw that poster. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He simply signed his name, Jim Bridger, and changed his life forever. The journey began in the spring of 1822. Dozens of men pushed their boats into the muddy Missouri, their rifles shining in the sunlight. These men would soon become legends, Jedediah Smith, Hugh Glass, Thomas Fitzpatrick, and the young Jim Bridger among them. The river was long and dangerous. The current was strong. The mosquitoes were thick. Every bend brought a new risk: wild animals, storms, or attacks from tribes who saw them as invaders. But Jim wasn't afraid. He watched the older trappers, how they hunted, built fires, and read the land, and he learned fast. He became known for his courage, his silence, and his sharp memory. When others got lost, Jim found the way. When others panicked, Jim stayed calm. The wilderness was testing him, shaping him into the man he would become. One night, their camp was attacked. Arrows whistled through the air. Men shouted. Jim barely had time to grab his rifle before chaos broke out. He saw one of his friends fall beside him, an arrow in his chest. He fired back, heart pounding, smoke filling his lungs. By sunrise, the attackers were gone, and several of Ashley's men were dead. For the first time, Jim understood the true cost of the frontier. It wasn't glory, it wasn't gold. It was blood, fear, and survival. But instead of turning back, Jim pushed forward. Because in his heart, he knew this was where he belonged. Weeks turned into months. The rivers turned to mountains, the forests to endless plains. Jim had never seen land so wild, so untouched. He hunted buffalo, fought storms, and crossed rivers that no map had ever marked. He began to feel something powerful inside, a bond with the land itself. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was becoming part of the wilderness. The boy from Missouri was fading. In his place was a new man, a mountain man, a frontiersman whose name would soon echo through every campfire tale of the West. As winter approached, the expedition reached the far reaches of the Rocky Mountains. The men built shelters, trapped beavers, and traded with local tribes. At night, when the fire crackled and the cold winds howled, Jim Bridger would sit quietly, staring into the flames. He thought about his parents, about the life he left behind, and wondered if they would be proud. He didn't know it yet, but his name would soon become legend. He would discover new lands, survive impossible odds, and build a fort that would help thousands of travelers cross the wilderness. But for now, he was just a young man sitting under a blanket of stars, listening to the whispers of a vast, untamed world. The adventure had only just begun, and so, the orphan from Missouri took his first step into history, guided not by fortune or fame, but by the endless call of the horizon. The year was 1824. America was still young, and the land west of the Rocky Mountains was a mystery. No map showed what lay beyond. But a teenage trapper named Jim Bridger was about to change that forever. He didn't set out to make history. He was just doing his job, hunting, trapping, surviving. Yet sometimes the greatest discoveries happen when no one is looking for them. By now, Jim had spent nearly 2 years in the wilderness. He had learned to walk softly, to follow animal tracks, and to read the weather by the smell of the air. He spoke a little of the Crow language and traded peacefully with several tribes. He was no longer the quiet blacksmith's apprentice from Missouri. He had become a true mountain man. He dressed in buckskin, carried a long rifle, and could live for weeks on what he hunted. The fur trade was booming. Beaver pelts were worth a fortune back east, and every man in Ashley's company wanted to be the one to find new rivers rich with fur. For them, every mountain ridge could lead to gold, not the shining kind, but the soft, silvery pelts that made hats for the world's richest men. It was early summer when Jim and a few companions split off from the main group. They were following the Bear River, winding through the high valleys of what is now Utah. The air was dry, the sun hot. Days passed, and the river seemed endless, until one evening the valley opened wide. In the distance, the men saw something shining like glass under the sunset. At first, they thought it was a mirage. Then, as they rode closer, they realized it was water, a massive inland sea, stretching farther than they could. See, Jim Bridger stood at the edge of the Great Salt Lake, the first white man ever known to reach it. The water sparkled beautifully, but something was strange. There were no trees on the shore, no birds in the air. Jim dipped his hand into the lake and brought it to his lips. The taste was bitter, burning with salt. He spat it out, confused. It wasn't like any lake he had known. For days he and his men explored the shoreline. The air was dry, the ground cracked with white crystals. No fish, no plants, only silence. Jim thought back to what he had heard from older trappers, rumors of a great western ocean beyond the mountains. Could this be part of it? Had he reached the Pacific Ocean, trapped inland by land and mountains? He believed he had, and word of his discovery of the Pacific spread fast among the fur companies back east. It wasn't until years later that explorers realized what it truly was. Not an ocean, but a saltwater lake, the largest in North America. When word reached St. Louis, people spoke the name Jim Bridger with excitement. He was young, brave, and now famous. In taverns and trading posts, his story grew bigger with every telling. Some said he had seen sea monsters. Others claimed he found an ancient city beneath the water. But Bridger himself stayed silent. He was no storyteller yet, just a man who preferred mountains to crowds. Still, whether he liked it or not, his name was becoming legend. After his discovery, Bridger returned to life as a trapper. The wild did not care about fame. The beavers still needed catching, and winter was coming again. The Rocky Mountains were cruel in winter, blizzards that froze rivers solid, wolves that prowled at night, and months where food was scarce. But Bridger survived every trial. He made friends with tribes along the river valleys. He shared food, learned their ways, and earned their respect. Unlike many frontiersmen, Bridger didn't see Native Americans as enemies. He saw them as people of the land, just like him. He learned to speak their languages and even took part in their ceremonies. Years later, he would marry into the tribes. But for now, his heart belonged only to the wilderness. One evening, as Bridger's camp rested near the river, a band of Blackfeet warriors attacked. Arrows rained down. The trappers scrambled for cover, returning fire in the dark. Jim's friend was struck in the arm. Another man was lost to the river. For hours the fight raged until dawn broke over the valley. When the attackers retreated, only silence remained, and the sound of the river flowing on. Jim sat by the water, exhausted but alive. He had learned another lesson of the frontier. Out here, every sunrise was a victory. As the months passed, Bridger became known among his peers as a man of calm and courage. When storms hit, he found shelter. When supplies ran out, he found food. He had a sense of direction so sharp that others joked he could smell his way through mountains. Around the campfire, the men began to tell his story, the young trapper who found the inland sea. And though Bridger said little, deep inside he began to understand something important. He was not just surviving the wilderness, he was discovering it, mapping it in his mind, one river, one valley, one trail at a time. After winter, Jim joined Jedediah Smith on a new expedition south. Together, they explored more unknown regions, crossing deserts and snowy peaks. They followed rivers that no map had ever marked, giving them names that would appear on maps for generations to come. Bridger's discovery of the Great Salt Lake was just the beginning. He would soon help open the trails that would guide thousands of settlers west. But for now, he remained what he always was, a quiet man, standing alone beneath the endless western sky. He didn't know it yet, but destiny had only started calling. Jim Bridger had found something far greater than gold or fame. He had found the edge of the known world, and had the courage to cross it. The wilderness had taught Jim Bridger how to fight, how to survive, and how to endure. But now, it was about to teach him something greater, how to belong. He had spent years exploring rivers and mountains, discovering new lands that few white men had ever seen. But the secret to surviving the West wasn't just knowing the land, it was understanding the people who called it home. The frontier was not empty. It was filled with nations, the Crow, Shoshone, Flathead, Blackfeet, and many more, each with their own ways, stories, and laws. They hunted the buffalo, followed the seasons, and lived by the rhythm of the earth. At first, the trappers and the tribes met with caution. Guns met bows, silence met stares. But men like Bridger knew that fighting the land's people meant fighting the land itself. So he listened, he learned, and in time, he earned their trust. Jim began to pick up the words of the Crow tribe first, the people who roamed the valleys near the Yellowstone River. Their speech was rich, their gestures expressive. He learned to greet them, to trade respectfully, to share tobacco before speaking of business. Soon he could carry a conversation, tell a joke, or ask for directions in their tongue. To the tribes, this young white man was different. He didn't look down on them. He didn't treat them as enemies. He spoke with patience and respect. They gave him a name, one that meant the man who knows the land. From that moment, Jim Bridger was no longer just a trapper. He was a bridge between two worlds. Bridger spent long months living with the Crow people. He joined their hunts, shared their meals, and sat beside their fires at night listening to their legends. He watched their dances, the rhythm of drums echoing through the open plains. He saw their strength, their pride, and their deep connection to the earth. They taught him how to make moccasins from elk hide, how to use every part of a buffalo, and how to track game without leaving a single footprint. In return, he traded goods, fixed guns, and shared his knowledge of the white man's tools. He was still an outsider, but he was welcome. The Crow saw in him something rare, a man who respected the old ways. Not every tribe was friendly. The Blackfeet, fierce and proud, often attacked trappers and rival tribes. Bridger had seen their arrows fly and their warriors ride out of the morning mist. He knew the danger of traveling through their lands, but even then, he tried to avoid bloodshed whenever possible. He learned the signs of peace, the way to hold up a blanket, to show open hands, to speak with calm. More than once, that knowledge saved his life. Still, the West was unforgiving. One wrong word, one wrong step, and peace could turn to war. Bridger carried that weight every day, the thin line between trust and danger. It was during these years that Bridger met a young Flathead woman, the daughter of a tribal chief. She was gentle, strong, and wise beyond her years. Through translators and smiles, they began to understand one another. Over time, friendship turned to love. The Flathead chief saw in Bridger a man of honor and gave his blessing. The two were married in a traditional ceremony, a union not just of two people, but of two worlds. They lived together in peace for several years, moving between the mountain camps and trading posts. She taught him her people's songs, and he taught her English words. They laughed together under the wide sky, far from cities and war. Though their time together would be brief, Bridger never forgot her. She became his link to the native world, and a symbol of the harmony he always sought in the wilderness. In the rough world of trappers, family was rare. But Bridger found joy in the simple things. A shared meal, the laughter of his wife, the peace of knowing he was part of something larger than himself. His friends often joked that Jim had gone native, but deep down they admired him. He could speak with chiefs and generals alike. He was trusted by both sides, a rare thing in an age of constant conflict. Through his wife and her people, Bridger gained an understanding that few white men ever would, that the land was not to be conquered. It was to be respected. But peace never lasted long in the frontier. Tensions grew between tribes and settlers. The fur trade brought more white men into native lands, cutting down trees, hunting buffalo, and claiming water sources. Bridger often found himself caught in the middle, translating words of anger, trying to stop bloodshed before it began. He was a man of peace in a world built on conflict. Sometimes he succeeded. Other times he had to run for his life. The wilderness was changing, and Bridger could feel it. The old world, the world of the tribes and the trappers, was slowly dying. By the late 1830s, Jim Bridger was known far and wide. To the tribes, he was a respected ally. To the trappers, he was a guide and a leader. To newcomers heading west, he was a living legend, the man who could speak to the land itself. He wore a mix of cultures, moccasins on his feet, a rifle on his back, and an amulet from his wife around his neck. He belonged to no one and to everyone. The mountains were his home. The tribes were his family. And the frontier, that wild, untamed place, was his heart. In a land divided by language, race, and war, Jim Bridger stood as a rare symbol of unity, a man who proved that understanding, not fear, was the key to survival. By the early 1840s, the West was no longer just a wilderness. It had become a promise, a dream whispered in the hearts of thousands. And standing at the edge of that dream was Jim Bridger, the man who knew the land better than anyone alive. For nearly 2 decades, Jim Bridger had roamed the Rocky Mountains. He had hunted, trapped, fought, and learned from the tribes. But now the world was changing. The fur trade, once the lifeblood of the frontier, was dying. Beaver hats were no longer fashionable in Europe, and the great trapping companies were closing down. Many mountain men returned east, poor and forgotten, but not Jim Bridger. He was not a man to give up. He knew the West still held riches, not of gold, but of opportunity. In the summer of 1842, Bridger met another mountain man, Louis Vasquez, a friend and fellow trapper. Around their campfire, they spoke of change, of how the land was filling with emigrants heading west toward Oregon, California, and the Great Salt Lake. Every month, more wagons rolled across the plains. Men, women, and children, all chasing the dream of a new life. But few knew how to survive the journey. That's when Bridger's idea took shape. Instead of chasing fur, he would build a place, a trading post, a safe stop for travelers, deep in the wilderness. A place where people could rest, repair wagons, buy supplies, and learn what lay ahead. He would call it Fort Bridger. In the summer of 1843, Bridger and Vasquez chose a spot on the Black's Fork of the Green River, in what is now Wyoming. There, beside clear water and rolling meadows, they began to build. The fort wasn't grand, just a few log cabins surrounded by a simple wall of cottonwood logs. But it stood strong and proud, like its founder. Inside were stores of flour, sugar, cloth, gunpowder, and tobacco. Outside, travelers could see smoke rising from the chimney, a sign of welcome in the endless wilderness. Fort Bridger soon became famous across the frontier. To weary emigrants on the Oregon Trail, it was a miracle, a place of rest, food, and friendly faces after months of struggle. When settlers arrived at Fort Bridger, they often found Jim himself waiting to greet them. He would shake their hands, share coffee, and answer their questions. "Which road should we take?" they would ask. "Where can we find water? How far to Oregon? Will we meet Indians?" Bridger would listen carefully, then draw maps in the dirt, marking rivers, mountains, and safe passes. He never exaggerated, never lied. He wanted them to survive. To those travelers, he was not just a trader. He was a guide, a guardian, and a living map of the West. In time, Bridger's knowledge became the key to the Great Migration westward. He helped open new routes, including the famous Bridger Trail, a safer path to the Montana goldfields. He guided Army explorers, scientists, and missionaries. He even led famous names like John C. Fremont through the rugged mountains, showing them passes and valleys no map had ever known. His words, his maps, and his stories became the foundation for the great expansion across America. Yet, even as the world rushed west, Bridger remained true to the old ways, living close to nature, trusting his instincts more than any compass. But peace was never simple. As settlers poured across the plains, tension grew with the native tribes. Hunting grounds were lost, rivers were polluted, old alliances began to break. Bridger tried to keep the peace. He warned both sides, settlers not to trespass and tribes not to attack. But greed and fear ran deep. More than once he stood between armed men and disaster, translating, calming, and begging for reason. Yet the frontier was no longer ruled by honor. It was ruled by hunger for land. Bridger could see it coming, a storm that would one day wash away everything he loved. By the mid-1840s, another great movement swept west, the Mormon pioneers, led by Brigham Young, searching for a home in the Salt Lake Valley. At first, Bridger welcomed them, offering advice and supplies. But soon, trouble brewed. The Mormons accused Bridger of selling guns to the native tribes. Whether true or not, it became dangerous for him to stay. One day, armed men rode to the fort to arrest him. Bridger escaped just in time, disappearing into the mountains he knew so well. When he returned months later, Fort Bridger had been taken. The Mormons now controlled it, flying their own flag above his walls. It broke his heart. The fort that bore his name, his dream, was no longer his. But Jim Bridger was not a man to live in bitterness. He returned to what he knew best, guiding, exploring, surviving. He led soldiers through the plains, hunters into Yellowstone, and surveyors across the Rockies. Everywhere he went, people spoke his name with respect. He had become more than a man. He was a legend of the frontier. And though Fort Bridger was lost to him, his spirit remained tied to the land he helped shape. By the late 1840s, the West had become a nation's dream. Wagon trains stretched across the horizon like rivers of dust. And on every map, in every guidebook, one name appeared again and again, Jim Bridger. He was the guide who made the impossible possible. The man whose footsteps led the way for thousands. He had built a fort, forged peace with tribes, and mapped the wilderness. But his greatest journey was still ahead, the years when war, betrayal, and discovery would test him more than ever before. In the story of the American frontier, Fort Bridger stood as a symbol of courage and hope. And behind it all was one man, half legend, half flesh, who never stopped believing in the wild land he called home. By the 1850s, the West that Jim Bridger once knew had changed forever. The wilderness was no longer silent. The sound of wagon wheels and marching boots echoed where once there had been only wind and wolves. The land he had explored, mapped, and loved was now a battlefield. After years of guiding settlers and soldiers, Jim Bridger found himself caught between two worlds, the native tribes he respected and the United States Army he now served. The government wanted more land, more forts, more control. The tribes wanted to survive, and Jim Bridger wanted peace. But peace was slipping away. Tensions flared as settlers pushed deeper into native territories. Hunting grounds were fenced off. Buffalo herds disappeared. Rivers once clear now ran muddy with blood and dust. The frontier was burning, and Bridger, once a man of freedom, now carried the burden of war. In 1853, the U.S. Army came calling. They needed men who knew the land, who could track, who could lead them through uncharted territory. And no one was better than Jim Bridger. He joined as a civilian scout and guide, working out of Fort Laramie and Fort Kearny. He was older now, in his 50s, but still strong and sharp. His eyes could read the land like a book, the bent grass of a trail, the print of a moccasin, the smoke of a far-off campfire. He could predict a storm or an ambush before anyone else even noticed a change in the wind. To the soldiers, he was more than a scout. He was a legend come to life, the man who knew everything about the wild. Then came the conflict that would test him like never before, the Utah War, also known as the Mormon Rebellion. By 1857, tension had exploded between the Mormon settlers in Utah and the U.S. government. President Buchanan sent an army to restore federal authority, and once again, the army turned to Jim Bridger for guidance. He had every reason to refuse. The Mormons had seized his fort and driven him out years earlier. But duty, or perhaps pride, brought him back. Bridger guided the U.S. troops through the high passes of the Rockies, leading them safely to Utah. He showed them secret trails, water holes, and mountain crossings that saved the army from disaster. Yet when they reached Utah, they found the Mormons waiting, not with open arms, but with burned wagons and empty settlements. Brigham Young had ordered his people to abandon and destroy their own towns rather than let the army take them. The land itself seemed to rise in protest, cold, barren, and defiant. Bridger watched as two sides of America faced off, both calling themselves faithful, both believing they were right. For him, there was no victory in it, only sadness. By now, Bridger had seen too much. He had guided explorers, settlers, and soldiers through valleys where he once hunted with friends from the Crow or Shoshone nations. But those friends were gone, killed, displaced, or broken by the endless march of progress. He began to feel old. The world was moving faster than even he could follow. Still, when the army called again in 1865, he answered. This time, it was the Indian Wars on the Great Plains, and the battle for the soul of the frontier had begun. As gold was discovered in Montana, thousands of miners demanded a shortcut through Sioux and Cheyenne lands. That shortcut became the Bozeman Trail, a route of blood and betrayal. The tribes resisted fiercely. They called it an invasion, not a trail. Raids grew frequent. Ambushes turned deadly. To protect travelers, the Army built new forts, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort Reno, and Fort C.F. Smith, all deep inside Indian territory. And once again they called on Jim Bridger to guide them. Bridger rode at the head of the Army column, scanning the horizon. He warned the officers, "Don't go too far. The Sioux are watching." But few listened. He had walked these plains since before they were on any map. He knew that the tribes would not let their land be taken without a fight. He could feel the danger in the air, quiet, tense, waiting. When Colonel Henry Carrington took command at Fort Phil Kearny, Bridger tried to counsel caution. But young soldiers, eager for glory, ignored him. They laughed at his weathered face, his stories, his warnings. To them, he was just an old man from another time. Then came December 21st, 1866, the day history would prove him right. On that freezing morning, Captain William Fetterman led 80 soldiers out of Fort Phil Kearny to chase a small band of Sioux decoys. Bridger begged them not to go. He knew it was a trap, but pride won over wisdom. Hours later, the entire detachment was wiped out, every man killed by Red Cloud's warriors in what became known as the Fetterman Massacre. When word reached Bridger, he sat in silence. He had tried to stop it. He had done everything he could, but no one had listened. After that, something inside Jim Bridger changed. He was tired, not of the land, but of man's endless foolishness upon it. He had spent a lifetime building bridges, between cultures, between people, between worlds. And now he watched those bridges burn. The West was no longer wild. It was being conquered, divided, and tamed. And in its taming, something beautiful was being lost. By the late 1860s, Bridger's health began to fail. Years of cold winters, sleepless nights, and countless battles had taken their toll. His eyesight dimmed, and his once steady hands began to tremble. The Army retired him from service in 1868, giving him a small pension, a meager reward for a man who had given his life to the land. But his story was not yet finished. By the time the 1860s turned to the 1870s, the West that Jim Bridger had helped discover was no longer wild. Railroads now crossed the plains, telegraph wires hummed where once only eagles soared, and towns stood on land that had once been untouched wilderness. For most men, this new world was progress. But for Jim Bridger, it was a farewell. After decades of scouting, exploring, and surviving, Jim Bridger's body began to fail him. His eyesight, once sharp enough to spot a trail from a mile away, grew dim. Years of snow glare and mountain winds had taken their toll. By 1868, Bridger was nearly blind. He could no longer ride far. no longer scout, no longer live the life he had loved. The army that once depended on him gave him a small pension, $8 a month, and thanked him for his service. It wasn't much, but Bridger didn't complain. He had never done it for money. He returned to Westport, Missouri, near the edge of what would one day become Kansas City, and settled on a small farm. There, surrounded by the echoes of his past, the great mountain man prepared to face the quiet years ahead. For the first time in his life, Jim Bridger wasn't moving. The man who had crossed the Rockies, faced grizzlies, and mapped rivers now spent his days sitting on his porch, listening. He could hear the wind rustle the grass, the distant whistle of trains, and the laughter of children. He could smell the earth, the smoke, and the rain. But the world he once ruled was now out of reach, both physically and in spirit. Friends and neighbors often visited, curious to meet the man whose name was written across maps. They would find him sitting under a tree, whittling a piece of wood, or leaning on his cane. "Are you really Jim Bridger?" they would ask. He would nod, smile faintly, and say, "That's what they used to call me." Even in blindness, Bridger's memory burned bright. He loved to tell stories, tales of frozen mountains, boiling springs, and strange lands that few had ever seen. Children would gather at his feet as he spoke. He told them of the time he first saw the Great Salt Lake, when he thought it was the ocean. He told them of the Yellowstone region, where water shot from the ground like fire, long before the world knew it as a wonder. Some of his stories sounded too wild to be true. Lakes that hissed, rocks that sang, forests that glowed. But those who knew him best said his words always carried a spark of truth. He was a storyteller, not just of facts, but of feelings, of how it felt to stand in a world so vast it could humble the soul. As he aged, Bridger watched as the West filled with railroads, telegraph poles, and settlers. The buffalo, once millions strong, were being slaughtered. The tribes he had lived among were being forced onto reservations. He felt torn. He understood progress, but he mourned what it replaced. In quiet moments, he would whisper to himself, "The land's still there, but it ain't the same." He believed that the spirit of the frontier, that wild freedom of the open land, was fading. And with it, a part of him faded too. From time to time, old friends came to visit. Fellow mountain men, soldiers, and trappers who had shared his roads. They would sit together, gray and tired, laughing about the old days. Sometimes the talk turned serious. They spoke of Jedediah Smith, who never came back from his last journey. Of Hugh Glass, who crawled through hell after being left for dead. Of Kit Carson, another legend now gone. They had all been heroes once, but the world had moved on without them. At night, Bridger would sit near the fire, his blind eyes staring into the glow. He would remember the sound of rushing rivers, the bite of mountain air, the cry of eagles at dawn. Sometimes he would speak softly, as if to the land itself. "I was there when it was new." He remembered riding beside Crow warriors, trading with the Shoshone, and standing atop the Rockies when the world seemed endless. Even as the years took his strength, his spirit remained unbroken. He had lived without fear, and he would face death the same way, with quiet dignity. In the summer of 1881, at the age of 77, Jim Bridger's long journey came to an end. He passed away peacefully at his farm, surrounded by a few family members and friends. The man who had once walked through storms and battles slipped away like a whisper on the wind. They buried him on a hill overlooking the plains, the same plains he had crossed as a boy so many years before. In time, the world would come to honor his name. Fort Bridger, Bridger Pass, Bridger Mountains, and even Bridger National Forest were named after him. But his true legacy wasn't in names or monuments. It was in the courage of every man and woman who dared to chase the unknown. In every map that showed the once hidden trails he discovered. And in every story of the West, because somewhere in each one, his shadow still walks. Every great frontier needs its legends. And in the story of the American West, few names shine brighter or wilder than Jim Bridger. He was a trapper, an explorer, a scout, and a storyteller. But between the truth and the tales, where did the real Jim Bridger stand? Was he a man of history, or a myth born from campfire smoke? In the long winters of the Rockies, when snow buried the land and the wind screamed through the passes, mountain men gathered around fires to keep warm. There, with nothing but flickering flames and coffee for company, stories grew. Stories of courage, of monsters, of places so strange they seemed like dreams. Jim Bridger was the best of them all. His voice was slow and deep, his timing perfect. He could hold a group of rough, weathered trappers in silence with nothing more than a whisper. And when he spoke, the wild came alive. One of his most famous tales spoke of a land where the earth boiled. Geysers shot water into the air, and the ground was alive with heat. He described pools of bubbling mud, rivers that steamed, and stones that hissed when thrown into the water. Many listeners laughed. They called it fantasy, old Bridger's dreamland. But years later, explorers found it. Yellowstone National Park, exactly as he had said. He had seen it decades before anyone believed it existed. And though his words sounded like magic, they were true. Proof that sometimes the unbelievable is simply the undiscovered. In another story, Bridger spoke of a petrified forest, trees turned to stone, birds frozen mid-flight, and a landscape of silent beauty. Even the woodpecker, he said, was stone, still hammering his beak against a stone tree. Men roared with laughter when they heard it. But again, he was right. There was a petrified forest, the great one in what is now Arizona, where ancient trees had indeed turned to stone. It wasn't a lie. It was Bridger's way of describing wonders no one else had the words for. Then there was his tale of a lake that burned like hell itself. He claimed to have seen flames dance upon the water, the air thick with smoke and the smell of sulfur. Men accused him of exaggeration, but the truth lay deep in the earth, in the volcanic springs and bubbling pools of the West, glowing with natural gas and mineral fire. What seemed impossible was, again, simply misunderstood. Of course, not every story was real. Sometimes Bridger's tongue wandered for fun. He told of rivers that ran uphill, of a mountain so high he could see the back of sunrise, and of a buffalo so big it blocked out the sun. These were jokes, told with a twinkle in his eye. He never meant to fool. He meant to entertain. And in that rough world, laughter was a rare and precious thing. To Bridger, storytelling was an art, a bridge between men, a moment of warmth in a life of cold. But what truly made Jim Bridger remarkable wasn't just his tales. It was the truth beneath them. He had seen more of the West than any man of his time. He had walked through lands no white man had mapped. He had learned from the tribes, their trails, their language, their wisdom, long before the world cared to listen. When he spoke of boiling rivers or frozen forests, he was describing reality through the eyes of a poet of the wilderness. He wasn't lying. He was translating the unknown into something men could imagine. Bridger's stories weren't just about places. They were about people. He told of the Crow Nation, who adopted him as a brother, of the Shoshone who taught him to hunt and survive, of the endless respect he had for their way of life. He understood that the West wasn't just a land of danger. It was a land of beauty, wisdom, and spirit. He had lived among the Native Americans for years, and unlike many white men of his time, he saw them not as enemies, but as equals in courage. That respect gave his stories heart. They were not just adventures, they were lessons. After Bridger's death, newspapers, dime novels, and storytellers turned him into something even larger than life. They painted him as the wildest of mountain men, a hero who fought bears, led armies, and discovered everything west of the Mississippi. Some of it was true. Some of it was fantasy, but in the end, it didn't matter. Because by then, Jim Bridger had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of what it meant to explore, to endure, and to believe in the impossible, even now. Historians argue which of his stories were fact and which were fiction. But one thing is certain. Without him, the story of the American West would be far emptier. He gave the frontier its voice. He gave the wilderness its wonder. And in doing so, he gave America its mythology, every campfire tale of courage, every cowboy's dream of freedom, every legend of the mountains, somewhere inside it all. There's a trace of Jim Bridger. He didn't write books. He didn't seek fame. But his stories outlived them all, because Jim Bridger's truth wasn't just in maps or forts. It was in the dreams he sparked, in the awe he left behind. "A man may die," he once said, but the land keeps his story alive. And so, as long as the mountains stand and the rivers run, the story of Jim Bridger, half man, half legendary, will never fade. The American West, wild, vast, and untamed. Before railroads, before settlers, before maps had names, there were men who dared to walk into the unknown. And at the heart of that unknown walked Jim Bridger. He didn't just explore the West. He defined it. In the early 1800s, maps of America ended where the plains began. Beyond that, blank space, filled only with whispers and legends. But to Jim Bridger, the blank spaces were an invitation. He had no compass, no roads, just instinct and the stars. He read the land like a book. Every mountain's shadow told him direction. Every river's bend told him story. Long before the world called him a guide, he was already mapping the West with his memory. In 1824, a group of trappers from the Rocky Mountain Fur Company set out from the Green River country. Their goal, find new trapping grounds and rivers rich in beaver. Among them was a young Jim Bridger, only 20 years old. The party split, and Bridger followed a river west. The air grew heavy, the water tasted strange. When he finally reached the end, he stood before a vast inland sea, silent and shimmering under the sun. It was the Great Salt Lake. He dipped his hand into the water and tasted it, bitter as brine. He didn't know it then, but he had just become the first white man to ever see it. That discovery would mark the beginning of a new chapter, the exploration of the Great Basin, the heart of the American West. The more he traveled, the more he learned. He studied every valley, memorized every pass. He could name rivers that no map had ever shown. He found paths through the Rocky Mountains, routes that would one day carry pioneers and soldiers west. One of them became famous, Bridger Pass, in what is now southern Wyoming. Years later, when the Union Pacific Railroad laid its tracks, it followed that same trail. Bridger's instinct had been perfect. He had chosen the smoothest, safest route through the mountains, long before engineers ever touched it. His trails became highways of the future. In the decades that followed, Bridger's name spread across the maps he helped create. Bridger Range, Bridger Creek, Bridger Mountains, all reminders of the man who found them first. Each place told a piece of his story, not written in ink, but carved into the land itself. He didn't claim ownership. He never drew attention to himself. To him, naming something meant remembering it, making sure that the wild he loved would never vanish completely. By the 1840s, Bridger had become the man everyone wanted as a guide. Army expeditions, wagon trains, and even government surveyors sought him out. He had a reputation. If Jim Bridger led you, you came back alive. In 1843, he helped lead John C. Fremont, the famous explorer known as the Pathfinder, through the mountains. Bridger showed him secret passes, safe camps, and places where no soldier had ever stood. Fremont took the credit in his reports, but Bridger was the one who found the way. That was his way. Quiet, humble, but unforgettable. When the Oregon Trail became the lifeline to the Pacific, thousands of settlers followed paths Bridger had already discovered years earlier. He warned them where the rivers turned dangerous, where water ran out, where storms would hit. Many didn't listen. Many died. But those who followed his advice, those who trusted the wisdom of the mountains, made it safely through. He wasn't just a scout. He was the invisible hand guiding an entire generation westward. In 1843, Bridger decided to stop wandering, at least for a while. He and his partner, Louis Vasquez, built a trading post in southwestern Wyoming. They called it Fort Bridger. It was nothing grand, just log walls, a few cabins and a blacksmith's forge, but it stood at the perfect crossroads. To the north lay Oregon. To the south, California. To the east, the plains. To the west, the mountains. Every traveler passing through the west came to Fort Bridger. Trappers, soldiers, missionaries, families, even gold seekers. They traded, rested, and listened to Bridger's stories. His fort became more than a stop. It became a legend. As the years passed, Bridger continued to guide Army expeditions. Through Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, he found Bozeman Pass, connecting the Yellowstone River with the Gallatin Valley, a discovery that would later pave the way for the Bozeman Trail, one of the most important routes in the northern plains. He knew the Continental Divide as intimately as most men know their own backyards. Every canyon, every stream, he remembered them all. Not from maps, but from memory, smell, and sound. His mind was a living atlas of the West. By the time Bridger grew old, the West was changing. Railroads were coming. Settlers were arriving in endless waves. The wilderness he had once known as boundless was shrinking. But even as the frontier faded, his name remained, on passes, rivers, valleys, and trails. He had never written a single page of a journal. But he had left behind something far greater, a map made of memory and courage. His footsteps became the blueprint for America's expansion. He never sought glory, never built empires. He only walked, further, deeper, longer than anyone else. He turned the wild into something known, and yet somehow he kept its soul alive. Maps fade, the narrator says softly, but legends don't. And that's why, even today, when travelers cross the mountains of Wyoming or gaze upon the wide plains of Montana, they still whisper his name, Jim Bridger, the man who mapped the unknown. By the 1850s, the West that Jim Bridger knew was changing. The trails he had once walked alone were now filled with wagons, soldiers, and settlers. The wilderness was shrinking, and with it, the old world of the mountain men was dying. But for Bridger, the fight wasn't over yet. A world at war in 1853, tension between settlers, native tribes, and the U.S. government reached its breaking point. The Army began sending troops west to build forts, guard trails, and keep the peace. Bridger, now in his 50s, found himself caught in the middle. He had friends among the tribes, men who had shared food, danger, and loyalty with him for decades. But he also worked for the Army, guiding expeditions and scouting new routes. To one side, he was a trusted friend. To the other, a hired guide. And in between, a man trying to hold two worlds together as they tore each other apart. As settlers flooded into the Utah Territory, conflict grew with the Ute and Shoshone peoples. Bridger knew these lands, and the people, better than anyone. He warned commanders that broken promises and greedy land grabs would lead to bloodshed. But no one listened. He had spent half a lifetime building peace with the tribes, learning their language, earning their trust. Now soldiers came with rifles where he once came with trade and friendship. The frontier he had helped open was being destroyed by the very people it had drawn. In 1857, another storm began brewing, this time not between tribes and settlers, but between the U.S. government and the Mormon settlers in Utah. Brigham Young, the Mormon leader, had built his own empire in the West and refused to accept federal authority. The U.S. Army prepared to march on Utah to remove him, and right in their path stood Fort Bridger, the same fort Jim had built with his hands, his home, his pride, his legacy. Mormon forces, fearing it would be used by the Army, seized the fort. They burned parts of it, took his supplies, and forced Bridger to flee for his life. When he looked back from the hills, smoke rose from the fort's walls, the fort that bore his name. Everything he had built was gone. After losing Fort Bridger, Jim retreated east to Missouri, heartbroken and angry. For years he had given his life to the frontier, its dangers, its people, its freedom. Now he had nothing left, but Bridger was not the kind of man to sit still. When the Civil War began, he offered his services to the U.S. Army once again, not as a soldier, but as a scout. Even in his 60s, his mind was sharper than any map, his instincts keener than any compass. In 1865, he guided troops through Montana, helping to establish routes that would later become the Bozeman Trail, a direct line through the heart of Sioux territory. But once again, his discoveries brought blood. The Bozeman Trail shortened the route to the Montana goldfields, but it cut straight through sacred Sioux hunting grounds. Bridger warned the Army, "You're building a road into trouble." They didn't listen. Within months, attacks began. The Sioux, led by Chief Red Cloud, fought fiercely to protect their land. Bridger guided troops through the mountains, helping them survive harsh winters and ambushes. But deep down, he knew the war was wrong. He had walked those valleys long before soldiers came. He had seen the peace that once lived there. Now it was all gone, replaced by fear, blood, and betrayal. For the first time, Jim Bridger began to see the end of the world he had helped build. By 1868, Bridger's body was failing. Years of hardship, frostbite, hunger, and endless travel had taken their toll. He was nearly blind, his back bent with age, but even as his eyes dimmed, he could still see the land in his mind. Every pass, every river, every ridge. He had lived 100 lifetimes worth of danger and wonder. And now, all he wanted was peace. He returned once more to Missouri, settling near his daughter on a small piece of farmland. The roaring rivers and vast mountains of his youth were gone now, replaced by quiet fields and the soft hum of cicadas. Neighbors would come to hear him talk, the old man with the mountain eyes. He would sit on his porch, pipe in hand, and tell stories of geysers that boiled, forests of stone and lands beyond belief. To them, it all sounded like legend, but Bridger would smile softly and say, "I've seen it with my own eyes." As years passed, visitors became fewer. The new America, the one of railroads and cities, had little place for mountain men. Jim Bridger, once the greatest pathfinder of the West, spent his final years in silence. His hearing faded, his sight nearly gone, but in his dreams, the old trails came alive again. The sound of hooves on dry ground, the cry of an eagle, the rush of the Missouri River. He died quietly in 1881. At the age of 77, there were no headlines, no parades, just a simple grave marked by the name that once echoed across mountains. Jim Bridger, trapper, scout, explorer. He lived through the rise and fall of the frontier. He saw a continent open and close again. He watched the wild become tamed, the maps filled in, and the legends fade. But his spirit, the fire that drove him into the unknown, never died. Because some men don't just live in history, they create it. He was the first to see, and the last to forget. And in every canyon and mountain pass that still bears his name, the spirit of Jim Bridger still walks when the sun rises over the mountains of Wyoming and the wind sweeps across the plains. There is a silence filled with memory. In that stillness, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the footsteps of a man who once walked this land alone, the soft echo of Jim Bridger, the last of the great mountain men. Jim Bridger's story is not just about discovery, it's about vision. He was there when the world was new, when the land was wild, untamed, and alive with mystery. He was one of the first to see the geysers of Yellowstone, the salt waters of Utah, and the vast valleys of Montana. He saw rivers that had no names and mountains that had never been climbed. He lived in a time before fences, before maps, before limits. He didn't just find the West, he understood it, its danger, its beauty, its soul. By the time Bridger died in 1881, the world he knew had disappeared. The trails he once blazed were now wagon roads. The camps where he had slept under the stars were towns filled with telegraph poles and church bells. The wilderness he had loved, the silence, the danger, the freedom, was fading into memory. The mountain men, once kings of the frontier, were gone. The fur trade had ended, the buffalo were vanishing, and the tribes he had lived among were being forced onto reservations. It was the end of an era, and Jim Bridger was its last great witness. In the years after his death, stories about Bridger began to grow. Writers, travelers, and adventurers turned him into a legend. Half man, half myth. They told of Bridger wrestling grizzly bears, fighting off entire war parties, and discovering lands no one else dared enter. Some tales were true, others exaggerated, but all carried the same heart, the spirit of a man who never gave up, never turned back. He became a symbol, not just of the frontier, but of courage, curiosity, and resilience. He could find his way by the stars when the sky was clouded, one old trapper said, and by the smell of pine when the wind blew wrong. To those who came after, Bridger wasn't just a name in history books. He was the West itself, wild, free, and untamed. The trail he left behind today, his name still lingers across the American map. Fort Bridger, Bridger Pass, Bridger Range, Bridger Creek, every one of them a landmark to his footsteps, reminders that one man's wanderings can become another generation's pathways. Modern highways follow trails he once walked barefoot. Railroads cross mountain passes he discovered. Even satellites mapping the Earth trace the same lines he drew in his mind over 150 years ago. His work never vanished. It evolved. And that is the mark of true legacy. Bridger's legacy lives on not only in geography but in spirit, the spirit of exploration. Every adventurer who steps into the unknown, every climber who scales a new peak, every dreamer who follows a road beyond the map, they carry a little of Jim Bridger with them, because the real frontier isn't just a place. It's a feeling, that spark of curiosity that says, what's beyond that ridge? That was Bridger's gift to the world, the courage to wonder, and the will to go find the answer. One part of Bridger's story that still resonates deeply is his respect for the native peoples. Unlike many who came after him, Bridger did not see the tribes as obstacles, he saw them as teachers. He learned their languages, their trails, their customs. He married a woman from the Flathead Nation, and later one from the Shoshone. He lived as one of them, trading, hunting, sharing laughter and danger alike. In his heart, he carried both worlds, white and native, civilization and wilderness, and that made him something rare, a man who understood the West from every side. That respect remains a vital part of his legacy. In 1904, decades after his death, soldiers and frontiersmen raised a monument at his grave in Kansas City. A tall, simple stone marked with these words: Jim Bridger, trapper, pathfinder, scout, and guide. Beneath that stone lies the man who once walked from Missouri to the Pacific Ocean and back, more than any man of his time. His grave faces west, toward the mountains, toward the sunsets he loved, toward the land that will forever be his. Bridger built both, not with stone or steel, but with courage, memory, and the endless miles of the frontier. And though the trails are gone, the spirit remains in every explorer who dares to take the first step into the unknown. To the man who mapped the unknown, Jim Bridger.